Today's speaker, Dick Bolles, is the author of What Color is Your Parachute? A practical manual for job hunters and career changers, the most popular job hunting book in the world. He updates Parachute every year. The newest edition is this year. The Parachute book has been sold more than 10 million copies to date. It has been translated into 20 languages and is sold in 26 countries. It's used in 26 countries. Dick was a minister for many years before he became a writer. Prior to that, he majored in chemical engineering at MIT and graduated with a degree in physics in Harvard. Dick and his son Gary Bolles are no strangers to Google. Both of them have been involved in Google's Zeitgeist conference in the past. Today, we have asked Dick to help us with our future, each of our futures. What are you going to do in 5 years? Here, I am happy to present to you Dick Bolles.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, optimists. I always am amused that we clap before we've heard one word out of the person's mouth. I appreciate all of you being here today. I know there are other things you could do with your hour at noon. For me, it's a stroll in the park. I live nearby. I live 58 minutes away in the East Bay, Danville. And I always love coming to the Google campus with hardly a single face over the age of 30, because it's nice to see the youth of America. How many of you have given any thought to what you're going to be doing 5 years from now? Could you raise your hand if you have given it thought? Ah, that's impressive. I wouldn't have thought that. Very interesting. Of course, it's hard to figure out what you're going to be doing 5 years from now. I was thinking back in my own life. When I was 40, I could never have predicted in a million years what I was going to be doing just 5 years from then. At that time, I was canon pastor at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And in the next years, I was fired. In the next years, I was hired to visit every college campus in the 9 western states. I was hired to find out what was bothering those people. And I remember we had a meeting of my colleagues. I had 9 other denominations working with me. I was the Episcopalian, and the others were Methodist, everything you would think of. And we had this meeting at Glide Memorial Church, just using their offices. And they said, Dick, you're sitting nearest the blackboard. Would you put up what we need to talk about during our meeting today? And I said, sure. And they said, somebody needs to go to Pocatello. That was Idaho. We had a firebrand campus minister there that was always causing trouble, and we always had to go and soothe the feathers of the administration. So I put up on the blackboard, Pocatello. And then they said, Dick, we have to discuss the date for our next meeting. So I put next meeting. And they said, Dick, we need to talk about the people who are going to have to bail out. And I wrote, what color is your parachute? Because I was playing with the words bail out, and I thought it's either a leaky rowboat where you're taking the water out before you get swamped, or it's somebody jumping out of an airplane. I've always had a very playful mind. I like the mind that God's given me, but I like most of all about it that it's very playful. In 2002, I died, literally. I stopped breathing. My fingernails and lips turned black and so on. And they revived me, which I was grateful for. And so I had been dreaming. I lay down to sleep and I died during my sleep. And so I thought, when I woke up, I thought I was still in the dream, and all these white-coated people were rushing back and forth. And I thought, this is odd. I've never had this dream before. So I looked at them, and one of them came up to me, And the first question he said is, "Can you tell me your name?" And I said, "Yes, Dick Bolles." And then he said, "Can you tell me your Social Security number?" And immediately, because God gave me a bright mind, I realized he was testing the viability of my intelligence and my brain. So, as I said, the one thing I love about the mind that God gave me is I love how playful it is. So I said, I'm going to play with the next question he asked me. So he asked me, "What's your Social Security?" And I reeled it off. And then I was ready for him. And this was when George Bush was in the White House. He said, "Can you tell me the name of the President of the United States?" And I said, "Of course, Chowderhead." And at first he thought I was really gone. And then he realized I was joking. So, and my father, I got this from my father. My father was tremendously playful, and famously his last words as he lay on his bed dying were, "Thank God I won't have to go to the bathroom anymore." So I love that kind of playfulness. So when we had that meeting and I wrote that silly title on the blackboard for the item that we had to discuss, some years later, within the 5, when I was 43, I wrote a book. And what I put together all the research I could find about why people got sick of their jobs and what they did when they got sick of their jobs. And I went and interviewed people all around the country. I traveled, I kept a log. I traveled 68,000 miles back and forth, because I had a huge travel budget from these 10 different Protestant denominations that I was working for. And so eventually I put it all together. I just published it, self-published it. And I took it down to a copy shop in San Francisco, and I said, "Can you bind this together and make it be a book?" And they said, "Sure." And then I tried to think of what title to put on it, and they said, "Well, what title do you want to put on it?" And I remembered the laughter when that item had come up on the blackboard at that meeting 2 years before this, and so I said, "I'm going to call it, 'What Color Is Your Parachute?'" And nobody in the world could figure out what on earth I meant. So they started to think, well, it's an allegory. Maybe he means, is it yellow? Are you too afraid to jump? And blah, blah, blah. Didn't mean anything. That's the trouble. It was and is a joke. Now, it shot to the top of the bestseller list. I don't know why. And the average book sells, believe it or not, in its lifetime, total sales of the average book in this country is 3,000 copies. And if it sells, they studied how many business books were published 2 years ago, and in that year 1,000 business books were published, and 62 of them sold more than 3,000. Only 62 out of the whole 1,000. So when you hit sales like 10 million, people pay attention because they want to know why. And it isn't the charm of the writer, and it isn't the knowledge that he's got in his head or her head. It reveals a vacuum in our schools. I remember going to Hastings Law School. They asked me to speak there some time back. And I said, "How do you measure the number of lawyers you're producing so that it just fits the number that are needed out there?" And they said, "We make no such attempt. We don't try to match the number of people we're educating with what the job market wants. That's not our concern. Somebody wants to be trained as a lawyer, she or he can come here and we will train them." And that is the problem with so much of what goes on with our schools. It teaches us again and again to think, teaches us to store vast kinds of knowledges in our head, but it doesn't tell us a word about what to do when you want to move where the rubber hits the road. So the book has become so popular because of the vacuum in our educational system. No book in the world would sell 10 million copies if the schools covered that same topic in the curriculum. So that's always been fascinating to me. Now, 5 years from now, how do we figure out what we're going to be doing 5 years from now? Well, the trouble is, I like to sort of, with my training in techie pursuits at MIT and Harvard, I like to observe what people do. Never mind telling them, hey, you should go do this, you should go do that. I like to see, what do they do? How do they act? And I've discovered over the 40 years I've been in this field now, I've discovered that people approach the subject of what am I going to be doing 5 years from now in 3 different ways. The first way is to ignore the subject. I mean, luck, I guess, would be the summary of it. They decide, I'm going to depend on luck. I'll find out where I am 5 years from now, and that will help me to figure out then what I'm going to do. Now, that's kind of like surfing, isn't it? It's like saying, what are going to be the waves that will come along then? I'll leap on them, and I'll try to take advantage of them. But it's going to be luck. That's going to guide how I figure out what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now. And then I observed, by watching a lot of people over time, that there was another way in which some people approached the subject, and that was they would say to themselves, I'll know it when I see it. That was famously enshrined in Mamma Mia, where she had 3 fathers and she didn't know which one was really her father, and she said, I'll know him when I see him. As you recall from those of you who saw the play or the movie, that didn't work out. So, but some people say that. They say, I'm going to approach this the way I approach life. I'm going to keep looking around, and if I see something and it's really the kind of thing I want to do, I'll know it when I see it. And then there's the third approach that people take as an alternative. They don't like luck and they don't like intuition. They say, I'll figure out what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now by doing some forethought. I'll do some planning now, right now. I'll figure out some things about myself and I'll let that guide me. Now, that's fine if we call it designing. It's not so hot if we call it planning, because you cannot plan 5 years from now. You have no idea whether we'll be at war or what kind of natural catastrophes come along or what new technologies. You cannot plan, but you can design. Now, one of the ways in which I designed in my own life, and I'll use it as an illustration of what I mean, I used to camp with my family. Gary, one of my sons, is here in the front row. I always try to bring my own audience in case nobody else shows up. The way we went camping, we did camp in 40 out of the 50 states while my 4 kids were growing up. And when we would go camping, we would say, what might we need? Well, we might need a long tent pole because the car had a very bad radiator, and when we hit the desert regions of the West, sometimes the car would overheat, and you needed a pole to push the cap off the top of the radiator and let all the water spout out. And then, of course, you had to have a container with the water in it to replenish what went out of the radiator. So we didn't plan, but we tried to say, what are the kinds of things we're going to run into? And what might we need to deal with those problems or challenges? So that's what, if you're going to think about, I'm going to give some forethought to what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now, the best you can hope for is designing, gathering together under your own auspices and under your own watch, gathering together anything you might need to deal with what's going to happen 5 years from now. So how do you do that? Well, let's go back to all the different approaches. We said that either people are going to decide what they're going to do 5 years from now when they get there. That's luck. Or they're going to keep a watchful eye because they think if they see an opportunity, they'll know it when they see it. So it's either luck or intuition or designing. Now, what do you have to do to make, let's say we're fully trained by the computer and our whole brain has rewired itself a little bit. We know we're going to be looking for keywords all the time. We're going to be scanning quickly. We're going to be looking for keywords. So what we need to do if we're going to start to think about what is going to happen with our lives 5 years from now is to watch for what keywords have to command our attention. So if you're going to take the approach of luck, and a lot of people do, and it's no shame, it's just the way they prefer to operate. If you're going to take the approach to luck and say, I'll just wait, what luck is going to depend on is intersections. The more people you run into, the more likely you'll have luck, so-called. So what we have to observe, if we're going to take that approach to what we're going to be doing 5 years from now, we have to make sure there are more intersections in our lives. That means a bunch of stuff. It means certainly paying attention to whatever meetings and stuff we go to in the course of our work. It means paying attention to getting on LinkedIn. There's also a nice app, which I like a lot, and some of you may not know it, called Jobs with Friends. If you're on Facebook or LinkedIn, you tell Jobs with Friends, you can search on that, I don't remember the exact URL, and it will ask for you to dump or let them dump all the people you're linked to and then all the people you're friends with, and it will catalog where they're working. It'll catalog whether there are any openings at that particular place where they work. It'll allow you to put up an alert beside the companies that look interesting. And the great thing about it is you already have a contact there because you're starting with your friends. You're starting with your contacts and then saying, and what kinds of opportunities might these friends give me access to? So Jobs with Friends is one way to do it. Checkster is another. Checkster is spelled Checkster, just what you thought. Checkster is run by a friend of mine named Yves Lemusi, Lemusi. And what you do there is you go to their homepage, it's checkster.com, I think, and scroll down, and there's a box that says My Talent. And you click on that. It allows you to designate 6 to 12 or more, if you want, colleagues that you have, friends that you have, people that know you like a book. And over your signature, Checkster will send them an email asking them to answer some questions about you, about your work habits and that sort of thing. And when they get it, they give you 7 days. They give the friends of yours 7 days to answer. And when they answer, they take the names off and they mash it all together and send you a summary. It's for your eyes only. It's all done by machine and it's free. So that's one way also to look at how to build connections in terms of how do I relate to people, how could I relate better to people? Because if I'm going to go down the route of luck to figure out what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now, I'd better have as many connections as possible so my luck increases. On the other hand, if you decide, no, I'm not going to just depend on luck, I'm going to be alert. I'm going to start to really pay attention. I'm going to live by intuition. I do that in my rest of my life. I'll do it with 5 years from now. Okay? What does intuition depend on? Well, a good example would be the husband who comes home and he tells his wife how much he loves her and he showers her with flowers and brings her chocolates, and she says, "You're having an affair, aren't you?" And he says, "How did you know that?" And she said, "Because you never bring me chocolates. You never bring me flowers, blah, blah, blah." This, of course, is an exaggerated allegory, but the point I'm making is intuition depends on what you notice. You notice what the benchmark is in your relationships with people and in your relationships with situations, and then when you see a deviation from that benchmark that you've noticed again and again operates, suddenly it occurs to you, hey, something's going on here because it's different. So what do you observe when you are depending on intuition? Well, you have to determine whether, generally, you know this now, right now, what do you like to work with? Do you like to work with just information, most of all? Or do you like to work with people, most of all? Or do you like to work with things like computers and stuff, most of all? Then once you decide that, well, I like all three, yes, but push comes to shove. Which of those three do you give preference to? Which of those three do you establish a priority for? Well, I think I most like to work with data or information. Okay, in that case, then what you pay attention to in the next years until you hit 5 years from now is you pay attention to everything you run into that has to do with jobs dealing with data, because at least you've begun to focus down a little bit. And when you see deviations like, oh, that sounds really interesting, I've never heard that before, you start to pay large attention. Now let's say you want to be a little more in charge of your life, so you're going to decide, well, I'm going to approach 5 years from now by doing some actual stuff now. The question becomes, what stuff should you do? Well, a good thing to do is an inventory of yourself. And that sounds ridiculous because you've lived with yourself these many years and you know yourself pretty well. So why on earth would you do an inventory of yourself? Why not somebody you don't know? And well, the answer is because we've already started to put ourselves in boxes. You probably know there were 2 articles in the New York Times these past 3 months about how to get hired at Google. And one of the points that they made was they liked to interview people who could figure things out. So, and I had another thought, which I've forgotten what it is, but it'll come back. So, you're going to do a self-inventory. What are you going to ask yourself? You're going to ask yourself, how have I put myself in boxes? How have I said, oh, I'm a tech, or oh, I'm a coder, or I do programming, or I do public relations, and that's who I am. You need to have a refuge from the concepts and pictures of yourself you've been living with thus far. If you're going to learn, you first have to unlearn. Very few schools talk about that. There's so many nutty ideas floating around that we are exposed to since we were tiny kids that we have to unlearn. And one of them is ourselves. What's your picture of yourself? If we're locked into the idea, I am this or I am that, that inhibits us from being able to be creative about what we're going to do with our lives 1 year from now, never mind 5. So you need an inventory that will sort of say, not I'm this and I'm that, but an inventory that starts out with an assumption. And the assumption is, I am a person. I'm a person who, ... And there are 7 ways in which you can look at yourself, and these 7 ways are in my book. In fact, I invented this because I was helping a bunch of people in 1977, I think, back when dinosaurs were roaming the earth. And I I invented this inventory for them. It's in my book, which incidentally, I suppose I should do some crass commercialism. My book is for sale in the back of the room, and it's only $5 today. That's less than it usually is. And there's a thing in the book, and also I have a workbook as well, which is not here. If you're going to think out what you're going to be doing 5 years from now, you cannot possibly plan that, but you can gather all the stuff you think you might need when you get to 5 years from now that might be helpful and useful. And the first thing you gather, when I was camping, the first thing we gathered was a tent. That was obviously our priority. When you are trying to figure out what you're going to do 5 years from now and you've decided not to go down the road of luck, not to go down the road of just intuition, but you've decided to really try to design, gather stuff you may need, the first thing you need most of all is rethinking who you are. Because what you're going to do flows from who you are, especially if it's appropriate work and meaningful work for you. So, in this inventory, you write stories, 7 stories, not all at once, one at a time, then try to figure out what that story tells you. Now, in the workbook and also in the main book, we take you down to the level of skills. Why? Because the further down toward the atomic level in your understanding of yourself that you go, the further down you go, the more flexibility you have. For example, I was in Spain a couple of years ago, and I was helping them. They were retraining construction workers to be computer repair people. That's most training programs. You've done one thing, it's sort of not demanded by culture and society anymore, so you learn one new thing. No, that is a horrible way to go about retraining. What you want to have is flexibility, and flexibility depends on getting down as far as you can to the atomic level. What's the most basic unit that makes up this thing called you? And the most basic unit is your skills. You have a brain, and the brain can do 2 things. The brain can store stuff. You know a lot about this, you know quite a bit about that. The brain is a storage area, but the brain also has another function. It can think. It can say, this is the pathway I will take, this doesn't make any sense, this new data comes in, I've got to integrate that into my understanding of what I'm supposed to do here. You can think, and thinking is one of the skills you need to pay attention to. What kind of thinking do you like to do? Do you like to synthesize? Do you like to break down and analyze? How do you like to use your brain? What parts of the different skill sets that a brain has, just just looking at it as a model, what are the different things a brain can do, and which of those do you love to do? So, if you're going to design how you're going to figure out what you're going to be doing 5 years from now, you need to have an inventory of yourself. That inventory needs to depend on stories. You need to break those stories down to as close to the atomic level of braindom as you can, and that means skills. What are your favorite skills? Never mind what the marketplace wants, who cares? You can always find ways to persuade people to do, give you work that lets you use your skills if you are enthusiastic about them. If any of you have to do interviewing now or later in your life, and 2 equally competent people come into the room, you will always end up hiring instinctively, if you're good at it, you will always end up hiring the one who has a lot of enthusiasm and passion for what they're doing. They didn't just choose this because they can do it, they choose this because they love to do it. And that's what your inventory is about. figuring out what do you love the most? What do you love to do? What knowledges do you love to use the most? And you figure this out now, because then this becomes some useful information to you that gives you flexibility. I did my own analysis of my own skills, and I had to write them out because I don't remember them. First of all, I'm very good at writing. Secondly, I'm very good at researching. I spend 4 hours a day researching. I'm very good at teaching, and I'm good at speaking. So, writing, speaking, analyzing, teaching, researching. Because those are basic atomic elements of who I am, they give me flexibility. I could be a writer, or I could be a speaker, or I could be an analyzer, or I could be a teacher, or I could be a researcher. When you get down to the atomic level of understanding who you are, you then have much greater flexibility. You're not committed just to become a computer repair person. You have many choices about what route you're going to take, as long as your inventory has gotten you down to that level of understanding of who you are. And that's what you need. So, when we think about, what am I going to be doing 5 years from now? I mean, I haven't got a clue for my own life. I know I'll be with my lovely wife. I know I'll treasure my lovely family. I know I'll always be searching for ways to help people, because that's in my DNA. I love to help people a lot, but I can't be more specific than that. I don't know what new technologies are going to come along. I do try to always adopt them. I'm sorry, I'm an Apple man and not an Android man, but otherwise I try to adopt new stuff. And so, when we think about our lives, think carefully how you're going to understand yourself, because your question of what are you going to be doing 5 years now depends on who you are right now. Thanks very much.